Chapter 2. My Mother's Blind Love. If there is one thing I learned in that first month in Istanbul, it is that love can make you stupid, blind in ways you never realized possible. My mother had always been romantic, swooning over the idea of rescue by Prince Charming. Back in Ukraine, she used to read discount paperback novels, the kind with swirling script on the covers, and spin daydreams about a better future. I never judged her for that. But now, it felt like her fantasies were tipping us toward danger. Living in that cramped apartment, I became intimately familiar with the weight of other people's eyes. His mother, a short, round woman, had a habit of muttering under her breath whenever I walked into the room. The sister, a woman maybe 10 years older than me, flashed me tight smiles that did not reach her eyes. And the grandmother, with her permanently sour face, refused to speak to me directly unless it was to deliver an order. If there was an equivalent of a red carpet in a welcoming home, this was the polar opposite. I was the intruder, the foreign burden, the reason they had to share their space. I tried being helpful. I would sweep the floors, wash dishes, even attempt to cook Turkish recipes from scraps of instructions gleaned off the back of spice packets. Nothing impressed them. They would pick apart my efforts with a shrug or a scolding. "She's clumsy," I heard one of them say. "She can't even handle basic chores," said another. My mother tried to intervene. "We're still adjusting," she would say gently. But they cut her down too. "If you truly want to help, you should do more to support your new family," they would snap. I never knew who was actually in charge. Maybe the old grandmother. She had a presence like a hawk perched on a branch, waiting to swoop down on any misstep. Despite the hostility, my mother acted like she was living a dream. She fussed over her boyfriend, fiancé, or caretaker, whatever we wanted to call him. She would ask, "Did you eat, Askim? Are you comfortable, Askim?" using that sweet Turkish term. He barely grunted in response, flipping through TV channels or scrolling on his phone, but she was convinced he was her protector. Whenever he slapped me or barked orders, she would smooth it over, telling me, "He is just tired. Life is stressful here. We cannot judge him by one action." I wanted to scream at her. "Mother, how many times does he have to raise his hand or his voice before you realize it's not a fluke?" But I never did. I was too angry, too hurt, and maybe too afraid I would lose her if I confronted her too harshly. I watched her eyes light up whenever he walked in the door, how she glowed under his slight nod of approval. She was in love, or in denial, or both. Love had made her blind to everything, including my bruises. One afternoon, I followed her into the tiny room we shared, crammed with a mattress on the floor, a suitcase for a wardrobe, and a rickety nightstand. She was folding laundry, humming a Turkish pop song off-key. I said her name. She did not look up. I said it again, more firmly. Finally, she paused, a sock dangling from her hand, her eyes questioning. "He's hurting us, Mama," I murmured. "Don't you see that?" Her face changed, a flicker of uncertainty, then immediate dismissal. "He is just under pressure. Istanbul is expensive, and the family expects so much of him. He is good to us, really. You will see once we are on our own." I pressed on. "I cannot handle how they talk about me. They act like I am some stray dog, and he is not." The words jammed in my throat. He was not decent. He was not fatherly. He was not even kind. She put down the sock, reached out to touch my cheek gently, coincidentally, the same cheek he had slapped a few days prior. "He's giving us a chance at a new life," she said softly, as though reciting a vow. "If we hold on a little longer, we'll all be happy." I realized then that my mother's devotion was not just blind, it was willful. She would do anything to maintain this illusion of a savior. And in her narrative, I was the rebellious daughter who just needed to trust him. Meanwhile, the rest of the family's hate for me took shape in daily jabs. The sister would sneer, "Go fetch more bread," but then complain if I came back too slowly. The mother barked at me to chop vegetables, only to snatch them away, telling me I was doing it wrong. The grandmother watched me like a prison guard. I tried to swallow the humiliation, to smile politely, to mumble "Evet" when they demanded something. In the rare moments I had alone, I would lock myself in the bathroom and just breathe. Once, I tried to wash my hair with the few toiletries we had, tears mixing with the shampoo. The door was banged open by the sister, who complained I was wasting water. Startled, I covered myself with a towel, her glare telling me I was an intruder even in basic hygiene. These humiliations chipped away at my sense of self. I was drifting in a place that refused to accept me. If not for my mother's dogged conviction that things would improve, I might have confronted them. Or left if I had anywhere to go. One day, tension erupted. I was in the kitchen trying to make tea. His mother had snapped something in Turkish that I did not understand, and I responded with tamam, not sure if I was agreeing to do something or just acknowledging her. Suddenly, she swung a ladle in my direction, not to hit me, but to startle me. Hot water splashed across the counter, narrowly missing me. I gasped, stepping back. Before I could react, she unleashed a rapid rant in Turkish, calling me useless, lazy, a parasite, words I recognized from the swirl of earlier insults. My mother rushed in, but she was powerless against the older woman's fury. The grandmother waddled in too, adding her own commentary. It was a chorus of condemnation, and all I could do was stand there, trembling, hands clenched. He walked in then. That man we depended on. He assessed the scene, saw me, wide-eyed, the spilled water, the furious matriarchs. In that moment, I thought maybe he would defend me. Instead, he shrugged. Inna probably needs more time to learn how we do things here. The women glared at me like I was an idiot child. My mother apologized on my behalf. The older women just scoffed and walked away. My anger coiled tight in my chest, but I swallowed it again because I had nowhere else to put it. That night, I heard my mother crying quietly, but she refused to let me see her tears. Maybe she was realizing how little power she had. Maybe she was regretting her blind trust. But when I tried to comfort her, she plastered on a shaky smile. I am fine, Inna, sleep. Everything will be better tomorrow. It never was, but illusions die slowly. Every day, I witnessed how she catered to him. She would sit at his feet while he watched television, massaging his ankles. Sometimes he would rest a hand on her head in an almost affectionate way. She glowed under that small gesture, as if it was the greatest reward, and I wanted to yank her away, to ask how she could degrade herself like that. But I was the child, and she was the mother, and I did not dare. I recognized a pattern. He would be verbally harsh, sometimes physically. She would weep, he would ignore her. Then he would do something small that hinted at kindness, a comment about her cooking, a pat on the shoulder. Suddenly, she was elated. She lived for those crumbs of warmth. In the eyes of the rest of the household, I was baggage, a bigger mouth to feed, a potential troublemaker. One evening, the sister cornered me in the hallway, hissing in Russian-tinged Turkish, "You think you are special? You are nothing here. If my brother did not want you, we would throw you both out." I bristled. "Then, why don't you?" I muttered back, surprising even myself with the boldness. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. She leaned in close, the smell of onions and cigarettes heavy on her breath. "Because he likes your mother. You are just part of the deal." Part of the deal? The words stung. Even though I had felt that reality, hearing it so bluntly was like a nail hammered into my heart. There was one strange moment when his mother came to me while I was folding laundry in the living room. She stood there, arms folded across her chest, and muttered something about understanding the ways of this home. She spoke in Turkish, slow enough that I caught something like, "If you behave, you won't have trouble." Then, in a softer tone, she said, "We are not bad people." I stood there, towel in hand, unsure how to respond. It sounded almost like an apology or a justification. Maybe she felt a shred of guilt for how they had been treating me. But she turned and left so quickly that I had no chance to respond or even process it. More than anything, I resented how distant my mother and I were becoming. We used to share jokes, to chat about small joys even in the bleakest times back home. Now, all we talked about was what to cook for dinner or how to meet the family's demands. If I tried to discuss my feelings, she shut down, fearful that negativity would ruin the fragile peace with her new husband. She realized deep down that she was losing me in the process of clinging to him. But her heartbreak manifested as denial. She latched on tighter, hoping the family would accept me if she just tried harder. She performed elaborate gestures, scrubbing the floors, cooking elaborate Turkish stews, praising their culture, anything to prove we were worthy. Her hair, once a shiny chestnut, started to fall out in strands I would find in the sink each morning. Oddly enough, while rummaging in a closet, I found an old dictionary, Russian-Turkish, dusty and half-eaten by silverfish. With no internet or data plan, I started flipping through it at night, quietly teaching myself more Turkish words. My mother was asleep in the next room, the man snoring. I would sit by a dim lamp, mouthing phrases like, "Help me, leave me alone. Where is the police?" I was not planning a grand escape, but I wanted some semblance of control. One night, I wrote a letter to my old best friend in Ukraine. I poured out how miserable I felt, how my mother was slipping away. But I never sent it. There was no address to mail it to, no money to buy international stamps. The letter ended up shoved in the dictionary as a makeshift bookmark, a silent record of my unraveling. Sometimes the tension would boil over. One of these times, my mother tried to defend me at dinner. His sister had complained that I was incompetent at cleaning fish. My mother snapped, "She is doing her best. You have no right to speak to her like that." Everyone froze. The grandmother glared, brandishing a serving spoon. The sister hissed, "You forget your place, foreigner." The man set down his fork with a pointed slowness and told my mother, "Calm yourself." She refused. She stood up, tears shining in her eyes, and ranted about how we deserved respect if they wanted us to be part of the family. In that moment, I felt a surge of pride. Maybe my real mother was still in there, strong enough to push back. Then he rose from his seat, grabbed her by the arm, and shoved her into the wall. The plates rattled on the table. Her head hit the plaster with a dull thud. My blood turned to ice. I sprang up to intervene, but one glare from him and I froze. My mother slid to the floor, breath knocked out of her. No one else moved. They just watched. The grandmother's gaze flicked from my mother to me, cold as a dead fish. In that silence, the reality thundered. We were alone, reliant on them for shelter, for the very food we ate. He finally growled, "This is my house. You show respect or you leave." Then he stomped out to smoke on the balcony, leaving my mother crumpled in a corner. I rushed over, hugging her trembling form. She sobbed, pressing her face into my shirt. The rest of the family resumed eating, like nothing had happened. That fight changed something in me. Before, I had believed my mother's illusions were simply naive. Now, I saw them as dangerous. She kept insisting, "He will calm down. He is just stressed." Meanwhile, her arm sported a bruise the size of a grapefruit. She spent the next day wincing whenever she lifted it to wash dishes. I started hating her, though I tried not to. But how could she choose him, this monster, over me? She was my mother, the one who had once bandaged my scraped knees, who had told me bedtime stories about brave girls who overcame all odds. Now she was letting him treat us like property. I decided to avoid the house as much as possible, wandering outside just to escape the rotting tension. A month into our stay, I had memorized the local streets, discovered a cheap bakery selling simit Turkish bagels, where the old owner gave me a sympathetic smile. I would nibble on stale simit in a nearby park, watching locals feed pigeons. It was my only sense of calm in this city of noise. Back at the apartment, I might find my mother resting against his shoulder, eyes half closed like a devoted servant, or see the sister smirking because I had missed some chores. The cycle of mild abuse and forced acceptance never ended. I might have found a job in a regular shop, maybe a bakery or a clothing stall, if not for that man orchestrating something else behind the scenes. He told my mother one night, "I have a better way for Ina to earn money." She nodded, relieved, believing it would be honest work. I listened from behind the door, a pit forming in my stomach. He talked about Laleli, a district known for commerce. Plenty of shops need foreign girls to assist with Russian customers, he claimed. My mother's eyes lit up because she spoke Russian too, and she assumed it would be a perfect fit for me. "Will she be safe?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. He gave a dismissive wave. "Of course, I'll keep an eye on her." I eavesdropped, heart pounding, suspecting that "I'll keep an eye on her" might mean I'll profit off her. But I was too exhausted to protest. If it meant fewer hours in this hateful apartment, I would do it. That night, my mother rubbed ointment on the bruise forming over her arm, staring blankly into space. I stepped into our tiny shared room, lips parted with words that could have been, "Let's run away," but I swallowed them. Where would we go? We had no money, no connections, and she was not strong enough to accept that we were living a lie. A final heartbreak in that apartment. On my last night before starting the new job, I lingered in the kitchen alone. The flickering light overhead cast weird shadows. I remembered how, back in Ukraine, my mother and I would dance in our old living room, waltzing to scratchy radio music just to keep warm. Here, the only dance we did was a contorted one around the family's demands. I heard my mother in the next room, trying to reason with him about letting me return home if things got too intense. He laughed, told her I would be fine, that I was tough. I looked down at my hands, noticing a small burn scar from handling a hot kettle earlier in the week. I realized I was tough, in a bitter, forced way. That night, I curled up beside my mother as usual, but there was a chasm between us. She whispered, "Good luck tomorrow, Inna. I know you will make me proud." I did not reply, because I did not know if pride was even possible in the direction we were headed.